We'll go ahead and get started. People are going to be sliding in and out. But welcome to Drexel Cybersecurity Institute. Really pleasure to be able to have you here today. You know, we started this series to be able to turn around and invite participants from Drexel University, but then also from across the community to be able to take a look at the whole range of cybersecurity, you know, from a cross-college, cross-domain perspective. The last couple that we've been addressing, and if we need to bring in chairs, just go on outside and just drag them in here, have really focused more on a policy perspective. So this is a great opportunity to be able to turn around and come back to technology, because this is a conversation in cybersecurity that always has to turn around and deal with those two components. And it's a real pleasure today to introduce our facilitator, Dr. Rachel Greenstadt. She's Assistant Professor of Computer Science here at Drexel, and her work is really focused on privacy and security properties of multi-agent systems and economics of electronic privacy and information security. And she runs a lab, the Privacy, Security, and Automation Laboratory. And then note, she's also very active in advising the Drexel Women in the Computing Society, so it's a great pleasure to have her here.
She's an associate professor.
Associate professor, right?
I think that actually takes effect on September 1, so.
You're an associate.
Okay, sounds good.
He's the dean, listen.
All right, I am not going to argue.
But I'm going to turn this over to Rachel to introduce her panel. You know, the way that we do these is be able to turn around and have a presentation and turn this over to Q&A. We'll also be videotaping this so it can be shared to a larger audience, but really appreciate you being here, and we'll do a wrap up at the end. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thanks for coming. So I'm going to keep this, can everyone hear me, by the way? I'm trying to be projecting. So the topic of this panel is sort of how can the privacy community respond to mass surveillance by governments and corporations. But in general, we're going to talk about privacy enhancing technologies and the role of technology in responding to sort of our current world. And I'm really hoping that this is a very active, interactive group. Otherwise, I mean, I guess we can just chat amongst ourselves, but I think that it would be much more fun to have a discussion. So Norm very nicely introduced me. So I've been here at Drexel for about 6 years now, and I do a lot of work on basically sort of understanding what you can learn from data mining people's social media streams and the text that they provide on the internet and what the privacy threats are with that. And that's the sort of theme of my research and the groups that I have. But I'd like to introduce my two panelists here. And actually, I'll probably let them introduce themselves. I guess we'll start with Roger Dingledine, who's the director and project leader for the Tor project, which is a software project dealing with privacy that some of you may have heard of before. So.
Okay, hi, I'm Roger. I'll give you the 1 or 2 minute spiel, and then we can go from there to questions. So Tor is a nonprofit foundation. We build software and try to educate people and train people around the world. The basic idea is that it's a program you can get that you can install on your computer, and you route through a network of volunteer relays. And the idea is that somebody watching your network connection can't figure out what website or other internet service you're going to, and somebody watching the website end can't figure out where you're coming from. So among researchers, I call that anonymity, but ordinary people might think of it as privacy. There are corporations and militaries and law enforcement who use it and think of it as security. And then there are a bunch of people in China and Iran and Egypt and other places who use it as reachability or safety, or there are a lot of different words we can use for the same security properties. So the basic idea is it's the volunteer network that I described. There are about 6,000 people volunteering relays right now, and your Tor software pulls down that list and then builds a path through 3 of them so that no single relay gets to learn both where you are and also where you're going. So part of the fun of Tor is the diversity of users that we have. I mentioned a few of them there, but part of the goal of that diversity is to have a variety of people using it so that simply the fact that you're a user doesn't tell them why you're a user. So right now we have 60,000 or 70,000 people in Iran using Tor every day. And the first thing that you might think of as a computer security person is, well, wait a minute. If you're using a safety tool in Iran, shouldn't they, grab you and stick you in jail because they know you're up to something wrong? But once you've got 60 or 70,000 people, then the average person is using it to look at their cat picture comics because you accidentally blocked their cat picture comics. So it's not the median user is using it for something totally ordinary, which provides cover for the much smaller number of people who are using it for political activism or something like that. And another fun thing about Tor is the diversity of funders that we've had. We've been funded by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a civil liberties nonprofit in California. We've been funded by the National Science Foundation. We've been funded by the Knight Foundation, which is the journalism folks you may have heard of, and the Ford Foundation. But we've also been funded by the Department of Defense and the State Department and some other groups like that. And all of them care about Tor for different reasons. NSF wants us to answer some hard research questions. The State Department wants us to go out there and spread democracy in the world. Part of our job is to teach them that actually it's freedom of communication that we should be spreading, and whether the folks in Tunisia want democracy is not our problem. We give them the ability to decide what their government, what their country, what their world should be, and it's up to them to decide from there. It's not up to us to figure out what's correct for Tunisia. So another of the fun topics we can talk about is the role of Tor in the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and Iran and what's going on in China these days. There's an active arms race in terms of governments funding their intelligence agencies / censorship wings to try to prevent people from reaching the Tor network. So Tor may provide good anonymity if you can get to it, but if they pull down that list of the 5,000 relays and block connections to it, so what if the network provides good anonymity if you can't get there, if you can't reach it? So part of our challenge has been coming up with steps back and forth in the arms race to make it so that if you're in, so Russia is a great example these days. Russia's working pretty hard on trying to block these sorts of things. So if you're in Russia, how can we make it so that you can safely continue to reach the Tor network? And then another topic that I'm sure we'll talk about is the whole NSA thing. It turns out large intelligence agencies in Western governments are trying to spy on everybody in the world. And there was a newspaper article a month ago in Germany detailing some of the deep packet inspection rules that they use to recognize Tor traffic flows. So basically some people read that and they're like, oh my gosh, NSA wiretaps Tor, I'd better not use Tor because otherwise if I do then they're going to see me. And I think the important lesson there is, no, they're actually tapping everybody. If you're using Tor, they have a chance of not knowing both who you are and what you're doing. If you're not using Tor, then the game is over before it's even started. So I had this debate with somebody where they're like, well, I can't use Tor anymore because they're watching it, so I'd best not. And somehow we have to get to the point where, so if somebody came to you and said, when you use HTTPS, they log your traffic. Therefore, only use unencrypted web browsing because that way you'll be safe. You'd laugh and you'd be like, that's nonsense. So somehow we have to get the use of Tor to that point where people are like, you have to use your safety online. Of course you have to. Yes, they might watch. They're probably watching everything. So those are a few topics, and I'm going to stop and let you pick up where you want to.
Well, for that, we should introduce Nadia. So Nadia is an assistant professor of computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's well known for her work in applied cryptography and cryptanalysis, and so I'll let her describe a little bit more of the stuff that she works on.
Hello everybody. So I have only been in Philadelphia for 1 year, so I started at Penn 1 year ago. And as Rachel said, yes, my research is sort of in applied cryptography. I have two strands essentially. One of them is sort of mathematical techniques in cryptanalysis, particularly lattices. This sounds very theoretical, but essentially looking at sort of the interplay between these techniques and the real world cryptography that we use. The second thread of my work is actually like breaking real systems using math. And I guess my interest in some of the topics that we're going to talk about today is sort of particularly for the crypto community and academic researchers in the crypto community. How do you actually think about all of these revelations? Is there a real way that we can respond? what do you do if you know, you've been going around doing your nice research, you think everything is fine, and then suddenly the floor is pulled out from underneath you. So maybe I will leave it at that, and then we can actually have a conversation.
Okay. So at this point, I think what I'm going to do is open it up to Q&A, because while I have some topics that we could discuss written down, I figure, you know, the whole point of this is to be a roundtable discussion despite the total lack of roundtables. You know, if anyone has any particular, it doesn't have to be a question, it could just be a topic, something on your mind, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll chat about it. And I'll give you a little while to think about that. Yeah, sure.
So I'll jump in. This is not questions, maybe just something to talk about, because it's been almost a year since Jacob Applebaum gave a presentation at the Chaos Computer Club. It was called "To Protect and Infect," and it talks about how it really dealt with what the NSA, what the capabilities were. And it was kind of a presentation that was meant to kind of blow people's mind in terms of what you think is possible is actually possible. A year after that, basically, I'm not sure exactly how much you know about the specific speech presentation that I'm referring to, but that was 2013. How much has changed or worse, or what more do we know from what the capabilities of surveillance in these organizations are today?
Well, I do have something written down here called Software Vulnerabilities, Backdoors, and Other Active Attacks Against Privacy, and I think that's what you're getting at. So what you're talking, I believe what you're talking about from that talk from Jake was talking a little bit about some of the more active methods of attack that have been used, where, you know, 0 days and breaking into routers and things like that and backdooring devices and cryptographic protocols have been used sort of as an end run around sort of more passive adversarial. So I think a lot of people in the past viewed intelligence agencies as what's called, as what people think about in crypto as a global passive adversary. They sit there and they watch everything, and then they maybe try and break it. They're eavesdropping, and I think what has become clear is that that's sort of, they're not content to do that and to do more active things. So maybe I'll ask you guys to weigh in a little bit on that question.
I guess.
You want to start?
Sure, I'll start. I think one of the remarkable things about the presentation that you and the particular leak that you're referring to is that in most of the Snowden documents, there was not a lot of technical detail. There were just hints about the capabilities. But the thing that at least blew the minds of everybody that I knew was that people had kind of been whispering. There were rumors about things before, like, oh, maybe this intelligence agency can do that. Maybe they're collecting all of this information. Maybe there's some secret laws or secret backdoors. And it turns out that, at least from the evidence that we have, and not just from that presentation, but actually from like all of the disclosures over the past year and a half, has been everything that we thought maybe they were doing, they'd done that and more. It's like, if you took sort of a technical expert who was mildly paranoid and said, what's the worst you think that they're doing? And you take that and then you go one step further, and that's actually what it appears that the reality is. So the thing that was just amazing was that all of this actually happened. It was like everybody's paranoid, you know, crypto-anarchist dream was the reality. Nightmare. So we have to, there's a big readjustment of expectations and like recalibration of what reality is. And everybody's still coming to terms with that. For the particular Ant catalog, from a technical perspective, at least from a nerd, I mean, all that stuff, I don't know, if all the hacker people I know, if we had unlimited resources and unlimited capabilities for surveillance, people would totally build that stuff for fun research. You can see that there's, within the classified community and the open unclassified community, it's kind of the same people and the same sort of mindset of like, we enjoy doing these things. It's just that in one community there's no oversight, there's no publicity, there's no checks and balances as far as we can tell of what's actually being built. And without any kind of transparency, it's hard to actually evaluate where that belongs in like a democratic society. I think that's the major problem for me. But in terms of like the technical capabilities, it's hard to tell, right? Because all we're getting is these leaks. They don't have any real context. So journalists, often journalists who don't have technical expertise, are trying to evaluate what's going on, and there's all sorts of misunderstandings, and you know, the government comes and says, oh, you know, you totally misunderstood that, that's not at all what we're doing, but they don't explain exactly what they are doing. There's things like the NSA oversight panel where there weren't any technical experts, so it was hard to actually tell whether they understood all of the right questions to ask. So
the answers that they got.
Or the answers that they got. So far, I mean, from my perspective, it's a total mess and we have no idea what's going on, but it's probably worse than we think it is.
Yeah, so one phrase there might be offense in depth. As security people, we always think of defense in depth, but from their perspective, imagine all the different layers that you can attack somebody at, and have a program to try to win at that layer, at each of them. So try to, when you're attacking Tor, for example, of course you should try to be able to watch a lot of the internet in order to be able to see a lot of traffic and start doing traffic analysis on it. But at the same time, you should research vulnerabilities in Firefox, because you might as well be able to, maybe they will stay anonymous until you break into their computer and take control of it. And I mean, there's another group in the Dutch law enforcement went to their Supreme Court a year or so ago to ask for permission to break into computers when you don't know what jurisdiction they're in. And it turns out that they had been doing that for years. And as usual, you go to the Supreme Court after you've been doing it and you ask for permission to retroactively make it legal, the thing that you did. But I think one of the key points that Nadia brought up was the lack of oversight on these things. Every jurisdiction makes its own decisions about what's a reasonable thing to do. And at least in the US, you go ask the Department of Justice, and the first person says, oh my God, no, that's unconstitutional, so you try again. And after a while, you'll get somebody who's happy with it, and then you take your legal document and you're all done. Tough world.
Yeah. I think also one of the things that's relevant here is sort of the difference between targeted surveillance and mass surveillance. So a lot of these things in this particular catalog were very targeted, and like sort of special purpose, tiny pieces of hardware bugs that you could implant places, boxes you could drop somewhere that would surveil local electronics. And this stuff is presumably fairly expensive and like requires somebody. Maybe it's not expensive. Okay, you're shaking your head. I don't know.
The prices on the calendar were on the catalog were pretty cheap.
But if you were going to buy 1 million of them, maybe not. I don't know. So it's still like there's a small group of people that we're going to deploy this against, or we have to individually deploy it against people. This is rather targeted surveillance, most of the things in that catalog. A lot of the legal documents that people are shocked about are these mass surveillance orders where we just collect everything that's going through a particular tab. So this is an entirely different scale. And there are people such as Matt Blaze, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, who are making the argument that it is difficult to say that there should be no surveillance at all. It's much easier to say that this mass untargeted surveillance is clearly against sort of the principles of our democracy. If you're going to have surveillance, maybe you want it to be something that's more difficult to do, that requires extra resources, that it's on a per person or a per small group of people basis, rather than just collect everything and sift through it later and see if anybody's done anything wrong.
It's not collection until you read it.
Yes.
Yes, the redefinition of words makes it particularly hard to understand what's going on here. I think a point that Roger brought up about the Dutch is interesting, is that it's not just, you know, it's not as much as, you know, we're kind of US centric here and we know a lot because of certain leaks about the US. It's not just the US that's doing this, and it's basically, you know, every intelligence agency out there, to whatever capability that they have, and are doing these things. So it's, you know, thinking about this, I think you have to take a little bit of a global perspective in some of these things. But speaking from, the democratic U.S. side of things, I think one thing that I agree with Nadia about the whole mass versus targeted thing, but what I think is a little bit troubling about this is sort of the dual-hatted nature of the mission of the NSA, where the NSA is responsible for this offense in-depth mission, but they're also responsible for information assurance and for defending us against, again, all of these other countries. And it seems that sort of whenever there's a choice between offense and defense, because it's the same institution, offense always wins.
Their budget is something like 90%, 10%, so that gives you a sense of their priorities.
So, I mean, in terms of people that are concerned about cybersecurity for us, right, the public in general, it seems like that's getting, short shrift, and somebody, finds a 0-day from a defense side, they report it to their superiors, and then they have to decide, well, do we try and fix that or do we try and use that? And I think in most cases, it's use that almost always wins, right? Yeah.
An observation that, in an attempt to invite some comment. I think one of the things that's happened in the post-Snowden era, however you feel about that, is that the executive orders that have come out have tried to figure out what the oversight piece is and what are the permissions piece from a court perspective. That was clearly one of the weak links in the pre-Snowden area. The answer was always yes, and they didn't even know what yes meant. But I think I think there is a move in the post-Snowden era to really have some legal kind of oversight. Is this really necessary in this case? And so I'd like to invite some comment on that. I'm also concerned there that it's really mostly by executive order, and please all remember that you can have executive orders you love, and they can be changed in a pen stroke in a couple of years. The second issue is really to do where, in what circumstances would it be a good idea for the NSA or somebody else to understand the metadata of traffic as opposed to the actually gathering the content, and what that could mean from a legal oversight perspective?
Okay, well, those are two different questions.
Yes, they are. Yes.
Okay. Does somebody want to? Do we want to start with oversight? And I mean, remember, so nobody on this panel is a lawyer. So first of all, I'll state that, or has legal expertise. I think it is clear that there have been, there's been movement legally and congressionally to respond to these sorts of things. And there have been executive orders that both limit and expand the scope of surveillance.
I think part of the challenge is the secret interpretations of all these things.
Yes.
So we can't really tell.
And
It's
the
trust. It's the trust level.
Yep. And the fact that the executive orders, among others, are totally fine with secret interpretations of laws means that there's nothing that we can do about any of this. I mean, Nadia brought this up earlier. When the NSA does something bad and you say, hey, that's bad, they say, no, you're misunderstanding. Let me declassify a small amount of thing that will contradict the thing that you were just concerned about. And now you're supposed to believe them that they just randomly chose a thing to declassify that shows you enough of what's going on that you've got transparency and insight, which is nonsense, because unless you know all of it, you can't decide whether they're arguing from a reasonable, rational perspective or not. So as long as the executive side is totally fine with secret laws, none of this can work.
Well, at least none of us can really have any assurance as to.
I agree with Roger that, well, I guess all of us are in agreement that, like, secret interpretations of secret law that are handled by secret courts with secret rulings that we never find out about, this is not democracy. Like, this is fundamentally anti-democratic, that we can't even have this conversation. And that, I think, is the biggest problem with all of the surveillance that's been going on. We can have an argument about like how much privacy should we have, how much privacy is it realistic to have, what kind of trade-off are we willing to have as a society, but if we can't have that argument with real information, then what kind of country are we living in, right? Have we already given up the democracy that we're hoping that we're actually fighting for? Mm-hmm. This is, you know, I want to be able to have the conversation.
But I guess to my second question really, and that is, if you can find cause for concern in the collection of traffic patterns and metadata, so on.
I think you can. I think this distinction between content and metadata comes from a sort of a very old metaphor of you send a letter and the content of the letter is the private thing, and the address on the outside is something that the post office can read, and they can't read what's inside, and some of that is public and some of that is private. And
the same metaphor happened with telephones, where in the 50s you would call up Sally and be like, hey, can you connect me to so-and-so? And of course Sally gossips and she knows who you're calling, so it's not like you can expect privacy from your phone calls.
So there's this idea of metadata in that sense, and that's where this whole separation comes. But once we start thinking about things like online forums and visiting websites, then it's the content itself that is public, and the only thing that's kind of private in that context is the metadata, right? It's who's looking at what and when and what are you searching for. It's not the stuff itself. It's an almost inverse of that relationship. So it's kind of to this argument to say that metadata is public and content is private doesn't make sense in a lot of the sort of things we do in an internet context. And I think that
isn't there also a change in technology that's going on? I was reading an end user license agreement the other day, and it said, "Oh, we're collecting non-personally identifiable information like your phone number." Now, wait a minute. My cell phone number is non-personally identifiable. Who else uses my cell phone, right? We have these. There was a time when we had phones, and I couldn't guarantee from a phone number who was using that number. But in this day and age, isn't there a rather significant shift in what's going on there, in what even defines personally identifiable data?
The scale of data now is so much more that even something that might not have been personally identifiable before, like there was a person standing on this corner at 3 p.m., if you have every single movement that you've made over the course of months, as you would if you collected which cell phone tower your cell phone was connecting to at 1 hour intervals, then that suddenly becomes personally identifiable because you are the only person who has those particular movements. And I think we've seen some grappling of this within like the Supreme Court ruling on car surveillance, whether you need a search warrant to put a GPS tracker on a car. And some of the arguments that were being made is like maybe the scale of the data that's being collected is more than just a single policeman who is observing the car in a particular location would actually be able to collect, and maybe that requires a different kind of legal oversight than just the policeman looking at the car on the street.
Though that's the question of whether they can actually actively add a tag to your car.
Yes.
If you got an Easy Pass or something, no problem, just call them up and they've already got the data.
But
so a lot of people
coming with cell
self-tag.
towers and Easy Pass. Right now it's just a court order to get a tower dump of hundreds of thousands of people whose phones are connected to a particular tower at a time. So.
Europe includes IP addresses as PII. America does not.
Yeah. So, I saw some
Much
people
good it'll do.
hesitantly raising some hands. So.
Question for Roger. Recently, some actors were injecting code into protocol headers, trying to de-anonymize some of the relay connections and look at the metrics there. Do you guys have a team that actually looks at security flaws, not just ones that are known or somebody's discovered, but one you're actively testing your network all the time to see if you do have potential security flaws from an offensive position?
Sort of. Tor is a large community of people, and part of that community are many professors and grad students all around the world who participate in a conference called the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Symposium, or PETS.
Which will be held in Philadelphia next summer.
Which will be held in Philadelphia
I
next
should
summer.
mention here.
And many of those research groups write papers analyzing the security of proposed and deployed Tor designs. So from that perspective, yes, we have a lot of people looking at this sort of thing and trying to break it. And there are a bunch of so 10 years ago, it was really unusual to have a paper about Tor in a major security conference. These days, every major security conference has a paper analyzing Tor. So from that perspective, we really succeeded where every city I go to has a grad student writing a Tor paper. So they all want me to come teach them more about Tor so that I can make them more useful to the world. On the other hand, there sure is a lot of work to be done in terms of researching the implications of all these proposed changes that we have, and especially when you compose changes, then they interact in ways that are hard to understand. So it's hard to get everything right. And again, so that's just talking about the Tor protocol layer. Those Firefox people sure have some security problems. And if we want to give you a browser, offense in depth.
There's also, I guess, the question of using academics to do Tor security testing. There is a slight misalignment of incentives there, because if academics are doing all of the analysis, or also the hacker community does security analysis of Tor, you can publish things that are interesting from an academic perspective, but it's harder to publish things that are not interesting from an academic perspective. So the interesting bugs might get found, but the less interesting bugs might be less likely to be found, but perhaps are easier to find by organizations with a whole infrastructure set up for finding boring bugs and flaws and exploiting them.
And I think Tor people internally are looking, but the core Tor development team is actually quite small. Security is hard.
I was talking to the person at the FBI who is in charge of whether they approve warrants, who's a big Tor fan, who came over and chatted with me at a conference and said, you folks have an image problem. I have an idea. Why don't you just take like 20 of your engineers, just a small number, and have them work on like marketing and branding and talking to press and so on. And then after like a year of these 20 people, you'd have it all solved. And then I tried to explain that we have 8 employees and another like 10 contractors, and that's huge compared to other privacy tools out there. And he was stunned that the 15 or something people could produce the thing that we've produced that has stymied large governments. So it's very true that the actual number of people developing these things is very small. And in terms of finding code vulnerabilities, Coverity was nice enough to volunteer their static analysis tool for us. And we actually, along with Ruby and a third one, were the first one to reach their, we found no problems in this code level. So that's a good sign. But static analysis is not everything. And at the same time, if you have entire departments at NSA whose job is to look through the OpenSSL commits and see what got in today, that's a tough adversary to keep up with.
I guess while we're talking about incentives, or since I brought up incentives, one of the problems that we're having, I think, within the privacy enhancing technologies community and sort of the a little bit the academic community, is that if you want your reaction to mass surveillance to be, hey, let's just have awesome crypto everywhere and deploy it, that's actually hard. So Tor does a really admirable job of building a tool and getting it out into the world and having it be used by hundreds of thousands of people, and that requires millions of dollars a year and a pretty significant number of staff for a project like that. If you think about other tools, they don't even have those kinds of resources, right? Something like OTR, off the record messaging, is a project that was a paper, and now there's a handful of professors who work on it part-time. And that's one of the best and most usable end-to-end crypto tools out there. There are other things now, like TechSecure, that are being developed that are a little bit more polished, I guess. But the resources that are being devoted to these things are fairly small, whereas we have these gigantic companies that are collecting massive amounts of data because it's in their market interest to do so. And they have way more resources than these little scrappy semi-academic, semi-hacker projects that are developing sort of usable crypto. Because usable crypto maybe isn't in the interests of the companies that have the resources to develop large, usable, end-to-end encrypted and anonymous, anonymity-preserving, privacy-preserving technologies. So one of the things that I've been sort of struggling with is how might you incentivize these companies that actually have the resources to develop large software tools to do things that would promote privacy among their users.
So that brings up, I think, a really interesting question. Everybody's outraged about what the intel communities have been doing, and you make very compelling points about the government and secret interpretations of secret laws. But imagine that we deployed crypto perfectly, and imagine that we deployed anonymity perfectly. The cell providers would still be keeping all of the data. They would still have that for their reasons. They need it. Google is going to have all of the information that Google has and keeps about you. Facebook is going to have all of the information. Aren't we facing is it all just a pipe dream to worry about any of it at some point? Either we're going to be tracked by a corporate entity which has even less accountability in some ways than a governmental agency, or it's going to be a governmental agency, or should I just throw up my hands? I worry about this a great deal.
It's actually worse than that, because
I'm sure it is.
Which is the answer to almost everything, in that it's both, right? Because you see that the government are the companies are collecting things that the government can't collect, and then the government collects them, gets it from the companies, and the companies are facilitated in their collection by governments that want access to this, so there's not a lot of meaningful regulation in that regard. So it's sort of, but I think that there is this situation where we have this situation where you have information as the business model, which is quite problematic, and coming up with alternatives is hard, for sure. And which, and as Nadia said, by the way, if you guys are interested in having encrypted conversations, then I do recommend OTR, by the way. It's one of the easiest, it's far easier than sort of PGP to deal with. But there's this sort of question about privacy for motivated individuals, which is a very hard problem. And then there's this idea of what lack of privacy does in general to society, which is a way harder problem, I think. So I don't know if you guys want to.
So Tor tries to tackle one of these layers, which is, can somebody watching at the network level figure out both who you are and what you're doing? So if you use Tor to log into your Facebook account, then Facebook knows the pseudonymous profile of whoever that person is and everything they do, and their friends and so on. So a lot of people say, well, then it's stupid and pointless to use Facebook over Tor, because aren't they getting everything anyway? Yes and no. It depends what security properties you're looking for. So 5 or 10 years ago, somebody in China went to Yahoo China and signed up an email address there, and then sent something that the folks in China got upset about. And they went to Yahoo and said, tell us who your customer is, because we want to make them a better citizen. And Yahoo said, why, certainly, you're a government. We follow the laws of all governments. Here's the user. And that person is now very sad. And if they'd been using Tor, even though their whole social network and all of that was connected, then the IP address that Yahoo had would not have been useful when they returned it. So part of our goal is not to keep everybody anonymous in all situations forever. It's to let you choose when you want to be linking this activity to the rest of the profile that they have about you or not. And it's a really hard social/research question how you do that successfully. But at least with something like Tor, you have the opportunity. And that's part of the goal of Tor, is by default to not leak anything, and then you can decide what to say over it. So if you want to log into your Google account, great. And if you want to make a new Google account and never log into it any other way than Tor, also great. And if you want to connect to all your friends, great. And if you don't, also great. So part of our goal is to build the underlying tunnel and make it by default safe enough that it works for whatever you're trying to do.
I guess another example of something is that even if I am logging into Google and I'm sending, say, I'm chatting with Roger or something, if I use OTR to encrypt all my messages, then Google knows that I've been chatting with this particular other user, and they have all the times and they have all the metadata of our chats, but they don't actually have the content. And they can't ever get the content because they don't have the keys. And I can't even decrypt the content later because I've forgotten the keys. So that's a win in some sense. I mean, it's a limited win, but it's something. I guess the question is, for normal users who don't know what an IP address is, who don't understand the threat model that cryptography is solving, who don't understand the particular threat model of Tor, how do you protect those kinds of people on a large scale? And right now we don't have the ability to do that. You can say, you know, use this technology and this technology and this technology, and people misunderstand what's going on, and they don't understand what a public key is, and they don't understand what a signature involves, and they don't understand what it means to have your IP address protected or not, and they don't understand that sending a text message is different from sending an IM, and it's just way too complicated for the average person. So I think it's an unsolved problem how to help the average normal person. I guess an example sort of a successful deployment of crypto is cell phone encryption. That things are at least encrypted between you and the tower. The tower can still, you know, they know exactly what you're doing because they have the other end of the encryption. But I sitting with a radio, I mean, except that some of the ciphers are broken, but you know, details.
And by some we mean basically all.
All of them. Well, yeah, okay, that's another problem. But my phone actually does speak crypto by default, and it's crypto that was kind of hard for people to break for a little while. The average person, I don't know. So, crypto can be transparent to the user, and it can accomplish goals, but that's something that the designers of the systems need to work on. And it's not something that the end users can en masse do anything about. There's also the question of, you know, if I want to use a particular cipher, do I know that it's good or not? And that gets into our lack of trust in the NSA at this point. So,
And by default, by extension, yes?
What do you think is the appropriate role of steganographic communication, like failures of
I'll let you answer that, since you've been using steganographic communication to some extent in your.
Well, only sort of.
Sort
not
of,
the way
yes.
that you are thinking
Yes.
of. So what Rachel is referring to is a feature in the arms race of censorship that Tor plays.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm saying that if you have an encrypted communication, people may not be able to read your communication, but they can see that you're communicating. That right there reveals a great deal of information.
Right.
And certainly, steganographic communication is not appropriate for widespread use. But how useful of a tool do you think this is for small numbers of parties to communicate secretly? The whole idea there is you're communicating and no one is even knowing that you're communicating.
Or maybe larger numbers. So my first thought, one of the security properties of Tor is, because of the diversity of users, just because somebody sees that you're using Tor doesn't mean they can conclude why you're using Tor. So in that sense, you don't need the stego. You have a group that you're blending with, and that group has enough variety that that it shouldn't be that dangerous to be associated with it. There are millions of Tor users now. Yes, I'm a Tor user. You can't guess whether I'm going to Facebook or Google or 911conspiracy.org. But that's not the whole thing, because we have large organizations wiretapping the internet to do deep packet inspection, to try to match up who everybody is and who they're talking to, and basically do traffic analysis on all of it. I started this arms race with folks like the Great Firewall of China, where they want to say, oh, that's a Tor flow, I'm going to block it. So then I have to say, oh, no, this looks just like Firefox talking to Apache, so if you block that, then you'll have to block lots of things. And then they find a way that our SSL certificate looks different, and the arms race goes back. And that's a crappy arms race to play, because you're never really going to look totally like the thing you're trying to imitate. But on the other hand, there are some other protocols that are easier to blend with. So one of the ones that we've been working on lately is a tool called Meek, which is developed by a Berkeley grad student. And the idea is that you actually use a browser to make an SSL connection to Google. And Google has this cool property where if you talk to any of the Google services using SSL, you can, once you've established the SSL connection, redirect to any other Google service underneath. So I can connect to www.google.com and then ask it for Google App Engine. So I can actually proxy through Google, but you think I'm just talking to the search page. And that means that they have to make a decision. Do I prevent people from talking to the search page? China did. Or do I allow them through and then allow these other people through also? So it's sort of a different layer of Stego. It's not, haha, you can't tell I'm talking at all, but it's rather, I find this group of people that's large enough and diverse enough that you're not willing to shut them all up, and I blend with them. So that was the arms race with bad governments that censor. And it turns out that it's a very similar arms race with bad governments that surveil, because they also have their deep packet inspection rules that look for certain characteristics of the traffic flow in order to decide whether to keep it long term so they can do traffic analysis on it later. So if we can somehow look like people do in Skype or people using BitTorrent or people doing other things, then we're driving up the cost of them realizing that this flow is one that they want to attack. So it's different than what people traditionally think of as steganography, but I think there's a role to be had there.
I don't know of any principled approaches to steganography, which is one of the problems with using it in practice. I mean, you can maybe do things like say, okay, I'm going to encrypt my message and then I'm going to try to hide it in a particular location, but without the kinds of formal models that have helped us actually bring crypto into a relatively, hopefully, unbreakable state currently. I don't know if there's any assurance that the steganography that people are developing is more than just sort of security by obscurity.
Yeah, when I did my master's thesis on steganography a long time ago, this is the essential problem. And sure, you know, it will work okay if you're a small group of people who again, and all you're really getting is security through obscurity from what we can say, because you're going to embed things in some message and you're going to probably lose some bandwidth, and probably, you know, it's going to be something that's either filterable or detectable in most cases, unless they don't know to look there. And that's the general case. There might be something there, but note that there's no real, you know, theory behind it beyond that. So it gets to that point of, sure, it's the sort of thing that might be useful for a small group of people under the radar, but isn't going to be any kind of large-scale solution. I think the large-scale solution in that case is, again, pervasive kind of crypto and anonymity type approaches, where it's like, again, nobody thinks it's weird that you want to talk to your bank in an encrypted way, or even, you know, sort of your healthcare site or so on. So and there may be some use, as we've seen recently, in terms of again adding some padding and things to when people are having those conversations, so it isn't possible to data mine out exactly what they're doing while they're doing it. But
if you're trying to hide in plain text traffic and hope that nobody will notice even though they know the algorithm, that's tough. Mm-hmm. If there's a lot of encrypted traffic and you too are encrypted traffic and they can't read what you're saying, you've got a lot more options.
Assumingly, again, encryption is good, which we're less certain about these days than we used to be.
I think there is this question of threat modeling, that if it's just you or a small number of people and nobody cares about you and nobody's looking, nobody actually knows that you're trying to do this, then, you know, you're probably okay, but you're probably okay anyway.
I'm going to say, what do I have to hide in response to that phrase?
But if you are actually sort of targeted by a government, it's probably not the solution that you should be using, because it's probably, I mean,
I think
Roger's talking about
yeah.
like this arms race and sort of increasing the cost of the people who are trying to surveil particular tools or particular people so that it becomes infeasible, and that's a way that it is useful.
Everybody's targeted by governments. You can't say nobody's looking at me. The whole point of all these wide-scale intelligence agency collection efforts is to look at everything, because you never know what's going to be interesting until later. So, I mean, we are past the time where you can say, I am small and not relevant, therefore they won't find me interesting. And part of the problem there is, so I was talking to a friend of the family who's 71, and he was saying, well, what do I have to worry about here? I use the internet to like buy and sell stocks, and I don't do anything weird, so what do I have to hide? And I tried lots of arguments on him, and I eventually hit upon the, okay, they're going to build social networks in an automated way, and if you were in the airport at the same time as that dude was in the airport, and then later you were at the shopping mall at the same time that dude was in the shopping mall, their automated heuristics are going to make conclusions about you that are inaccurate, and you won't know that it happened, and you won't be able to fix it, and suddenly there you are arrested for conspiracy when you've got nothing to do with any of this. And part of the job that NSA has is to catch all the bad guys without also catching everybody else. So step 1, collect all the data. Step 2, have no oversight. Step 2, reinterpret all the words that people are using when they're trying to reason with you about the situation. Not going to work.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that the privacy discussion is multifaceted with elements of technology, philosophy, and legal. And presumably most of us are experts more on the technology side, philosophy, and legal. I was curious what your thoughts were on how do we better educate ourselves about the other aspects, and then how do we educate people who are more experts in the philosophy and legal side about the technological implications, so that better policy decisions get made, down the road.
So I think that's a really good question. Again, we're also kind of the technology type people, but again, I think you are correct that to work and to reason and to be relevant in this area, you have to kind of, at least think about all of the pieces. And from the perspective, I think I'll let them talk about this too, but I'll mention something that one of my grad students did, and who is now graduated, in terms of being able to educate people. So he went down to DC and served part-time as an advisor to the Federal Trade Commission when they were investigating privacy problems. And he was, their part-time technologist, the one, and there was a big group of lawyers, and it was very useful to have him in the room when they were talking to companies, and the companies were like, well, we could never change that. It would cost billions of dollars and so on. And my student Mike would raise his hand and be like, can we have a short recess? And he's like, it's a Perl script. I can write it today and hand it to them, and just to call people out on that, and that's useful. And there are lots of roles like this. He's also currently on the advisory board now for Radio Free Asia. So if you are a technology person and you want to spend some time, educating, policy people about technology, there's lots of work to be done in that area, and that's an opportunity that you can have, and you can have real impact about that. I'll let you guys talk a little bit about that too, and maybe the other side, how you learn about.
I've been having great fun reading a lot of the court rulings that have happened over the past year. I mean, there's so many things that have been extremely relevant to practically our daily lives as technology people, that are being ruled on by federal courts, by local courts, and even just reading the judge ruling, it's incredibly educational. I guess examples, there was the Weave hearing that was actually in Philadelphia, and I went to the I actually went to the hearing and listened to the judges sort of questioning the lawyers, and it was sort of fascinating because they were trying to ask about technical things, and there's a lot of big questions. For people who don't know, Weave was arrested for essentially like a partner wrote a script to enumerate URLs that was releasing email addresses of AT&T iPad owners, and they got a couple 100,000 email addresses, sent them to Gawker, and then got arrested. And the partner pled guilty. We went to trial. He lost. There was an appeal. This went to the local appeals court in Philadelphia, and there was a question. There were sort of two big questions. One of them was whether, like, enumerating these URLs was a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which criminalizes unauthorized access or exceeding authorized access to a protected computer. And the question is, okay, is a URL a valid protection mechanism for a protected resource on a computer? That is an unsolved piece of
it's not a very
legal
effective
law
protection.
right now. Well, yeah, so
The law doesn't say effective.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
the law
So-
doesn't say effective, but I have published research papers where we enumerated all of the IP addresses on the internet, basically unmapping the entire internet. Did we and speaking to them, did we exceed authorized access just by, like, enumerating IP addresses? I don't know. Is enumerating IP addresses different from enumerating URLs? I don't know. I hope not, because that means that my research would be criminal. This is why I'm personally interested in this kind of law, and this is why I started reading about it, because it was like, oh my God, are they about to criminalize something that's a part of my, academic research? We win awards for papers like this, but then if you're a guy that nobody likes, maybe you go to jail. I mean, this is troubling. So this is, like, I don't know, socially just hobby of reading legal rulings because I'm scared of what the output would be. Stuff like reading the criminal complaint against the Dread Pirate Roberts, one of the most fascinating and amusing legal documents I've ever read. It's like a page turner. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend going. I mean, it's really disturbing, but it's also just fascinating. And there's a bunch of unsolved questions there, like, how did they find him? What was I going to say? There are a number of programs and there are movements to get people who understand both the law and technology. So if you like to take classes, I don't know, this sounds like an ad, but Penn has a program in tech law. Like, if you go to Penn Law, you can get a master's of engineering at the same time as you get your law degree, and you legitimately take classes both in the technology and the law. I was a grad student at Princeton, where Ed Felton is a professor in computer science. He spent a while at the FTC, being their chief technology person, and a number of his grad students, since he's been sort of going more and more into the policy arena, a number of his grad students are actually in DC now, basically being tech consultants for the government, for policy people who are saying, oh my God, I don't understand the technology, how do I, what's going on, can you explain this to me, what do we do, what's the right thing to do? And I have been in numerous situations where there's, like, congresspeople or, like, aides for congresspeople who are like, we don't understand the technology and we know that we don't understand the technology, please come and explain it to us. So I think if you are an expert in these areas and you go and you say, I'm willing to dedicate time to explain these issues to you, it's going to require learning on both sides, like there's a special language that they speak in DC, I don't speak that language. But if you learn how to speak that language, I think there's a lot of room to be effective.
They don't actually want to be ignorant.
Yeah, so there are basically an unlimited number of people in DC who are making very important decisions and don't understand the internet, and they want to. They're busy, but they're very happy when you show up and offer to teach them about it, so long as you're teaching them about the thing that they think that they should care about. I had a meeting with a staffer a while ago where I'm like, there's this privacy thing, it's really important, and they didn't care at all. And then I mentioned there's this censorship thing, and they're like, oh, tell me more about that. And it's the same stuff, but you figure out certain topics that they care about and certain topics that they've been told don't matter yet. And I mean, we as technologists can see the future, so we know that this topic's going to be more important later, and if only you learn about it now, then you'll be prepared for the later. That's easy for us to say and harder for them to believe.
Yeah. And I do kind of hope that this new Cybersecurity Institute, where we're here having this discussion, is going to be a forum for people to have these kind of conversations and learn about this sort of thing. I think that's a goal that we have. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, as one of, I don't know what other philosophy there might be here, but I out myself as one, and I think, just as Rachel was saying, is this type of an institute and taking advantages of opportunities to collaborate. I'm working with someone up at Cornell right now on an NSF grant that's looking at vocational privacy issues, And the NSF is really wanting these types of collaborations between technologists and philosophers and social scientists. And so I think the opportunity is there. But as the panel said, it is also, it takes a lot of time just learning each other's language. Because we both can say on both sides, we can say, oh my gosh, this is a really tough problem, and how are we going to address it? And so we each see the tough problems in different ways, but I do think there are opportunities. It's just a matter of, finding people.
One of my side hobbies is teaching law enforcement how the internet works. And part of the reason for that is that these volunteer relays who operate the Tor network, if somebody uses Tor and they connect to some website, and somebody gets angry about it, then the IP address of the volunteer at the end of the circuit shows up in the website logs. So if you don't know what Tor is, then you go get a list of IP addresses and you're like, okay, these are all our suspects, let's go steal the computer of every one of them, and then maybe we'll find something on the hard drive and we'll be farther along. And that's a lot of work, and it makes people angry, but that's how a lot of legal investigations work. And once I started explaining Tor to these folks, one of the phrases that one of the FBI people told me that I thought was really interesting was, look, I have 10 leads, and I have 72 hours before this case doesn't matter anymore. So if you can teach me which leads not to follow, A, I can do my job better, and B, I don't have to hassle your volunteers. So we've gotten to the point these days where if you run a Tor exit relay in the US and you get a subpoena from the FBI or something, you call them back and you're like, this is a Tor exit relay, let me teach you what Tor is. And at that point they're like, oh, I already know, thanks, never mind, I'll stop bothering you. So from that perspective, we can provide a lot more sustainability for the Tor network while making law enforcement understand that we're not the reason why their job is hard. I mean, it is hard to find bad guys on the internet these days. Bad guys have lots of ways of staying safe on the internet, whereas good guys have very few options. That's, I guess, a separate discussion. But these are all discussions worth having with people who make important decisions who typically are not technologists.
Yeah.
So within the privacy enhancing technology community, I'm just wondering if you have a perspective on the connection or interplay between what you typically have as both ends of a spectrum of research between theoreticians and system builders. What is your opinion on how well those two ends of the spectrum are working together or not working together?
Much better in the privacy world than in the general security world, I guess. The pets community is special in that there are people who care about the real world and people who are good at analyzing things.
Yeah, I mean, it is a spectrum, right? So there are systems people that are doing very applied things and don't pay much attention to the theory and don't have any theory. There are theoreticians. There are some theoreticians that really couldn't care if anything that they do is ever practical or anything that comes at it. But there is, I think there is a core community in the middle, the real world crypto community and the and a lot of people in the pets community where you do have practitioners and theoreticians and system builders and so on talking and collaborating. It's hard related to the sort of academic incentive problem. And it requires sort of constant work to value those contributions and make an effort to bring people together. I think like the stipend program that we have at PETS that helps bring people to the conference that might not otherwise be able to come in various ways has helped facilitate that. There's always more work to be done, but I don't know. What would your take be on that as a person from the theory side and more?
There's a bunch of overlapping communities. I guess, I mean, there's like the crypto community, which is split into like the really theory people, like sort of the hardware people. There's people who actually build things, which are, it's a relatively small part of that community. There's the academic security community, which, I mean, they build things, but sometimes you write the paper and then it's gone forever. I think, as Rachel said, the PETS community is unusual in having people actually like deploy their technologies and then they get used in the real world, maybe more than other parts of academia. I think for the crypto community and the part, to the extent that it counts as part of the PETS community or overlaps, in the past couple of decades, it's veered really, really far into the theory world, and I think that some of the events of the past year have actually shocked people into saying, hey, maybe we actually need to think about like the real world for a little bit. Not everybody has the training to do that, but there's been an increasing interest, for example, with the sort of new real-world crypto conferences, but also people starting to go to the security conferences and the PETS conferences and say, hey, what's going on here? Can I be helpful? I don't know if that actually is going to play out in like the academic incentives, because it's hard to get, especially if you're interdisciplinary, it's hard to get hired, right? Or it's hard to do this kind of work. And all of these kinds of projects actually are like so incredibly interdisciplinary that it's really kind of annoying. Yeah.
A lot of the problems that we have in terms of academics writing really useful papers about Tor, and this goes back to the question we had earlier also, if you're an academic research group, you find a potential vulnerability with the protocol or the design or something, and you write up a research paper showing just enough that you're right, that the program committee will accept it, and then you publish it and you move on. And you have a little section at the very end saying countermeasures. Well, you could do this or this or this, I guess, is basically what the countermeasure section says. And we're left having to reproduce the attack and then having to design and test all the defenses. So there's a huge gap in the academic world between what you're rewarded for your research paper and actually thoroughly evaluating the topic at hand.
Yeah, I mean, and being an academic and trying to actually translate your research into practice and release, software isn't something that you're particularly, it's not something you're particularly rewarded for, and it's something that takes resources. Like, I mean, there's several pieces of software that we release in my lab, and it's a constant challenge because maybe they were written by a grad student initially, and we have this fabulous co-op program where we have several of my co-ops in the room, and they've done excellent jobs at trying to help maintain and move forward this stuff, but it's a challenge every 6 months because someone new comes in and has to figure it all out and just start to make some progress on it, and then we have another person maybe, and it's not sort of the ideal software development situation in a lot of ways, but it does, I think that the co-op, but in a lot of cases, right, in universities, you don't even have co-ops, right? You just have, maybe you have some summer student for a couple of months and then they're totally gone, and you have grad students again who you want to, whose job is to get the papers out, so it's not an easy thing.
I'm an academic because you don't want me writing critical infrastructure code that needs to be maintained and needs to be 100% reliable. That's not my personality. Mm-hmm. My personality is to like think of something cute and then move on. Yeah. I think a lot of us are in that situation.
Yeah,
so I think they're
skill
actually,
set.
Yeah, I think there actually is kind of, we need to have the whole spectrum of people from like the cutting edge research to the like making the research practical, the kind of thing that Roger was talking about having to do with, where you take the research and then you actually flesh out all of the details, and then you put that into like building some kind of reliable thing that works and is usable and is maintainable and is deployable in the real world, and people talking with actual users. And there's this entire spectrum, and I think there's a little bit of a gap in the like really hard part of like understanding the new research and fleshing out all the details that is not rewarded by the way funding works. It's not rewarded by the incentive structure of academia.
And usually not industry either because of writing.
So governments are going to relentlessly spy on populations. Corporations will relentlessly try to gather as much information they can about every single user. Some people have taken a very personal challenge here and do everything they can to protect their identity using DuckDuckGo for web browsing. They're using Tor. They have multiple, online presence and things like that. Some other people have taken the attitude, well, nothing I can do. It's just going that way, and I can't help it. And it's just going to be that way, and I'm, going to go with the flow. Where do you see society, not the technology, but society being 5 years from now? When you talk to people, will more people be looking to take on the challenge of trying to protect their online privacy, or will the population have just gone in the direction which is, following the thought that there's nothing we can do? Where do you think the drive of society will be 5 years or 10 years from now, which will lead to some policy decision making and certainly lead to either making it more challenging for corporations and governments to acquire information if they don't have everything ready, or will they, or people just say, I don't care? What do you think what do you think the public will think here and globally 5 years from now?
That's a hard question. I think, globally, Roger can tell stories about how there are a lot of situations where, people are realizing that, again, we have a kind of awkward view on the world, that privacy matters in a very sort of visceral way. And I think, that's one thing that I worry about. I mean, I kind of, in a way, I think, things are trending in the way that you're talking about towards the badness. And from a societal perspective, we've never had that level of collection of data, period. And we've never had, a level that's significantly less than it without sort of really horrible, massive abuses happening. And, I kind of hope that that's not what it takes to kind of to get us to have better situations, but I don't know.
I think there actually has been a measurable change in the way society thinks about surveillance over the past year and a half, right? Like, your grandparents have heard about Snowden, and they've heard about all of these, collection orders, and they're thinking about it. Even if they don't understand, maybe they think it's cool and that we're catching terrorists, but everybody has heard about it. I gave a talk for some high school students, and they're like, yeah, my parents are talking all the time about the Snowden stuff, but I never understood what was going on. But they've heard about it. It's the sort of thing that non-technical people, non-cypherpunks are talking about over the dinner table. And it appears to be continuing, right? We have regular updates on new leaks. Who knows what's going to come out next? I don't know if it's actually going to accomplish our dreams, but at least the government has made concessions, and they've declassified some of these orders, and they've promised increased oversight. I don't know if it's enough, but it's actually the awareness has caused people to start thinking about these things. And there's other things that are not even surveillance, like the Facebook experiment, where they were manipulating
or the OkCupid one.
Well, yeah, people didn't care about that one as much, but the Facebook manipulating people's feeds and looking at their emotional responses. I don't think, it's not so much that research was problematic, but that somehow it brought into people's awareness the kinds of data that were being collected about them by these companies that they interact with, and the kinds of uses that these companies were making of this data. And actually it turns out that when people understand what's going on, they're really uncomfortable about it. And the more people understand what's going on, the more sort of children who always grew up with computers and have this model of how the internet works realize the extent of things being collected. I mean, maybe there's actually going to be a change. I'm hopeful, sort of, mildly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the situation we were in maybe 3 years ago was, and that we're probably, that we're slowly changing a little bit, is that all this collection is happening, but and people kind of vaguely understand that there's some vague privacy threat, but nobody really understands what it is or how much it is, and so people aren't able to have these conversations about it, and we can't societally decide what we think about it. We're getting closer to being able to have those conversations. I wouldn't say we're there.
So I've got two answers. One of them is people want security if it's easy. So, I mean, a lot of the security that we're getting on the internet these days doesn't come from people saying, damn it, I need some privacy, what am I going to do about this? It comes from Bing deploying SSL. Because somebody at Microsoft said, you know, it'd be a shame if somebody got to watch all this. Or maybe they said, you know, it'd be a shame if China got to send, who knows what their reasoning was. But the outcome is that a lot more people have encryption without even noticing it. So if we as technologists have the challenge of how do we make it so that more and more people are safe without even noticing it, so that we're shifting the expectation so that when you find that Hotmail doesn't do SSL, you're like, what the heck? Why are you weird? It used to be the other way, and now we're getting better at that. So that's one answer, which is that we can change it technologically to change what people expect. And the other answer, there's this recurring theme in dangerous countries like Iran and so on, where they have a revolution and everybody's like, I need to get to Facebook, and they're blocking Facebook, so I'm going to use this single hop proxy that's unencrypted, and it's fine that they can watch it and then they'll know what I'm doing because my government's stupid and they're not paying attention. They don't know how the internet works anyway. And then the theme goes, 6 or 9 months later, all the people who had said that are dead or in jail, and the remaining ones are like, oh, wait a minute, tell me about the security thing that you were talking about, because that seems to matter now. And that same thing happened in Tunisia, it happened in Egypt, it happened in Iran. And there isn't that much difference in terms of the adversaries in Western governments and those other governments. So are we now at the phase where people are like, oh, come on, my government's stupid, they don't care, what do I have to hide, they're not watching anyway, they won't do anything with it? And then later we'll find out that that's not so true? Hard to say.
You in the back.
Actually,
You're going to have to speak up, though, because we don't have...
Sorry, just a comment. So, on the other side, on the law enforcement side, right, we almost might disagree that privacy is important and online privacy is important. We want to, keep our identity private. But if you're actually trying to find criminal activity and you're trying to search for it, is the tools for encryption making it more difficult, right? Because that's the whole thing is to keep you private. Now, do we want the activity of criminals to be private as well? How do you balance privacy with the task that law enforcement does have? I'm actually more towards I want my online activity to be private, but at the same time, there's other big.
The very short answer is that right now it's very unbalanced. So it's easy to look at it and say, okay, well, good people get safety from Tor and bad people get safety from Tor, and it's a double-edged sword, so you have to make a decision. Do you want people to have neither or both? But right now the bad guys are doing great, and the good guys have very few options. So taking Tor away from the world harms the good guys and doesn't hurt the bad guys very much. So another way of phrasing this, I talk to a lot of people who say, but what about terrorists? Aren't you helping terrorists? So scenario one, I want to build a system that works for 1 million people, and it's going to work for the next year, and I can tell you all about how it works so you can help me analyze it. That's the Tor problem. Scenario two, I want to build a system that works for 20 people for the next 2 weeks, and I'm not going to tell you about it. There are so many more ways of solving scenario two. I get involved in a flame war on Wikipedia, and we know to go look at that flame war, and then that's where our messages are. Or I use steganography, and I hide stuff in images on eBay. As long as nobody knows that it's happening and it doesn't have to scale, there are a lot of ways of staying safe. Whereas in terms of keeping millions of people safe in an open, transparent way that a community can evaluate, we have very few options. So it's not, right now we're really unbalanced the wrong way. I think we need to somehow balance better.
Sorry, just a follow-up. I guess my problem with that is that, yes, to you we're balanced in a certain way, and where is that balance for each person is going to be vastly different. So I guess I lean towards what you're saying, that it's balanced in the way that you're describing it. But with so many different people, so many different things, that balance is someone else that we're actually balanced the other way.
So the government releases a yearly wiretap report, where they give statistics on the number of wiretaps requested, the number that were granted, and also the number that were unable to be granted because of encryption. And the number that are requested, it's tens of thousands, something like that. This is the federal government, I think. Maybe it's more than that. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of wiretaps every year, and the number that have not been able to be successful because of encryption until 2 years ago, the number was 0. Then there was 1 out of many, 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 many thousands, and last year it was still in the single digits, even with sort of all of this increased information about surveillance. So I think there are actual numbers backing up the fact that it is not, like, encryption is not actually a problem for the law enforcement case at the moment. There have been, like 2 cases of people being, I guess two sort of federal court cases of people who were, like, unwilling to give up their encrypted laptop passwords to law enforcement. I mean, so we can have a discussion about, like, where the proper line is, but it seems, for the most part, like, I agree with Roger that it's weighted on the other side. So the current questions that are being debated are things like, do you need a warrant to install malware on people's computers? Do you need a warrant to install malware on hundreds of people's computers, every single person who uses, like, a Tor hidden service? Do you need a warrant to get a cell tower dump that includes 100,000 people? And like a handful of people using encryption isn't actually making a dent in that.
There is this contradiction where the privacy people are saying, oh my gosh, look at all this pervasive surveillance, look at all these capabilities, look at these billions of dollars of budget, look at these catalogs of attacking tools, look at these people stockpiling 0 days in order to be able to break in any way they want to. Look how insecure we are, look how at risk we are. That's one side. And the other side is law enforcement, with programs like the Going Dark program saying, look, the amount of the internet we can surveil is going up linearly, and the amount we can't surveil is going up exponentially. So give us money, because we're unable to see things. Our capabilities are disappearing because this internet is so complicated compared to what we can see that we need to have more permissions and capabilities and secret laws and so on. Otherwise, we can't do our job. So there's a huge contradiction where each side is panicking because they look like they're losing. And these can't both be true. Or can they? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's sort of a question that relates to the previous one. So I don't know how the situation is here in terms of courts and how they give out warrants. So, like, why are we even having this discussion of catching bad guys if someone needs the information? Can they just get a warrant and not mess with everyone else and just file that person individually?
Well, I mean, that is one of the questions that we've been asking, right? Because that's in theory, I think, how a lot of people thought that it was supposed to work.
Right.
But it turns out that you don't actually need a warrant for a lot of electronic information, right? Like,
you just kind of ask for it.
The Stored Communications Act, which is from the 80s, or it was the Electronic Communications Privacy Act from the 80s, specifies that so email that is stored on a remote server that has been there for 6 months is considered to be abandoned, and therefore you don't have any interest in it anymore.
So
and
you have no expectation of privacy?
Yeah, you have no expectation of privacy.
So they don't need a warrant?
Yeah, they just need a subpoena to get this information. That goes, from the prosecutor to the company. Many of the large email providers, Google, Microsoft, have now said, we're going to require a search warrant in order to get the contents of email accounts, but it's not actually the law that this is required. So the situation legally is a lot more shocking than people realize, that your information is not actually protected, or your electronic information is not actually as protected as you think it is.
Okay. Plus, I mean, when we're talking about in terms of you're interested in one person and you go after a cell tower, there's sort of a lot of collateral damage there where you get 100,000 people's information. And and do you look at it, and can you then go after those other people that you didn't have a warrant for, etc.? So there's a lot of questions. I think we have time, but we have time for one more question. So who is the one more question? Okay?
I'd like to get a little clarity on the definition of privacy, because I'm also not a lawyer, but there are a number of categories of privacy, also identity. So if I use Tor and I hide my IP address and I generalize my browser config so you can't track me by that, but I'm still producing content, maybe in the role of a political dissident, I understand that there are ways to just take that prose, completely absent any meta information like my IP address, and figure out who that is if you can compare it to a significantly large corpus of text. Could you speak a little bit more about that problem domain? And also, are you aware of any law enforcement activity in that domain? So,
as it turns out, so that's my research. So that was a pretty leading question there. So yes, there's, so yeah, generally speaking, if you have about 5,000 words of text of a set of suspects, and then you have a piece of text that is roughly in the 500 word range, with a couple of caveats in terms of a couple of different things, like they didn't actually try and actively hide their writing style, and it's roughly within the same domain, though Becca over there can talk to you about what happens when it isn't, then yeah, you can usually identify someone with some level of confidence that they're in that you've correctly identified them by their text. I wouldn't want to rely on this as sort of a sole identifier, but it's something that can. And yes, we have talked with law enforcement, and we know that and we put our code on the internet, and we know that there are law enforcement agencies that are using it to analyze text on the internet. So it's a threat. There are countermeasures you can take. Don't write very much is one, but that's not very good. We also have a tool called Anonymouth, which is a clunky research tool. We're working on making it a little bit smoother right now, which helps people to understand whether a piece of writing that they've written does or does not reveal their identity, and make suggestions about maybe how to edit it so that it's less identifiable. So I can speak to that a little bit.
So these sorts of technical attacks exist and can work, but if you read the court documents that Nadia was talking about, all of the interesting attacks on people trying to stay safe on the internet lately have been social engineering or route around the technology attacks. So there are more court documents than just the one that she was talking about the Dread Pirate Robert Silk Road thing. And apparently the way they busted the Silk Road guy was they anonymously showed up on the internet and said, hey, we want to sell you some drugs. And the Silk Road guy is like, hey, employee, hook them up with a buyer so we can see if they're for real. And the employee was like, well, I'll just buy it. So he provided his home address, and so they showed up with the kilo of whatever it was, and they delivered it, and then they went in afterwards and busted him and turned him. And suddenly they had a person who had root on Silk Road on their side. And at this point, the technology is not the issue.
Yeah.
And over, there are these stories of we got a good actor to go make friends with the person, and then they went out hiking, and then he told them what he does.
So normal police work still works.
Yeah, whereas like the most high profile stylometry being used to identify someone was probably some of my colleagues at Pittsburgh identifying J.K. Rowling as the author of The Cuckoo's Calling, which, so, I mean, which is a concern and was a concern for her, but again, that was really more of a confirmation attack, because what happened was, like, her publisher's lawyer's wife had heard about it, who wasn't supposed to hear about it, who leaked it to a journalist, who then contacted some academics who did this analysis. So again, it was really the social engineering attack there, whereas this, linguistic identification just provided kind of additional weighting and evidence, even in a case like that. So with that, You know, I think I wanted to thank you guys all for coming here and making the discussion interesting, and I wanted to thank my panelists whose arms I twisted to be here, and for being here, and thanks a lot for coming and joining us for the roundtable.